It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and Joe Dolan.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast, presented, of course, as always, by DraftKings. Love having my original co-host, some might say my original co-founder of the Fantasy Feast Podcast, since he basically helped name it, my buddy Evan Silva on the show. Evan, always great to have you. Of course, you know him from Establish the Run. Look at it. He's got all the backdrop, the whole deal. He's at Evan Silva on social media, still killing it at Establish the Run. Thanks so much for coming on the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I thought it was so awesome that Tay noticed you on the field after the game on Sunday, and I'm so happy for your success. You've been absolutely killing it, Ross.
Thank you. I don't know if I would say she noticed me. I noticed her, and I got her attention. But she did say, "Oh yeah, I know you. I know you."
That's
that
enough.
was good enough for me.
That's
right?
enough.
And you know what? I think that's probably about right. She probably knows there's a big former football player from Wyomissing that talks to her dad. That's probably about the extent of it, and that's fine. That's good enough. I'm happy about it. I'm happy to have you on the show. Of course, everybody can check me out on social media at Ross Tucker NFL and check us out at Ross Tucker Pod. Joe should be back next week. Joe Dolan, he is at the Senior Bowl, actually. Down there in Mobile, talking with players and coaches and checking out some of the draft picks. So good for Joe to be down there in Mobile. How are things going, by the way, before I move on with Establish the Run? Another good year for you guys?
Another awesome year, another year of growth, and couldn't be happier.
I love it. Well, so there's a bunch of stuff to get into. I guess since the props are already up at DraftKings, and since the Super Bowl will be here before you know it, I did want to at least ask you your thoughts on if there were any prop bets. You probably haven't really dove into it yet, but anything that jumped out to you initially?
Yeah, I would say that some props are up. I think that more props will come up as we get closer to the game. Certainly the full menu should be available to us next week. Two props did stand out to me when I did an early look at them. Deebo Samuel over 55.5 receiving yards at -115. That's pretty close to even money. Deebo Samuel, had the injury, the shoulder early in the playoffs, was a full practice participant all last week, was a huge part of the game plan. Was it going to be a huge part of the game plan in the game where he got hurt? He had 2 early catches, went out on the second drive, was a huge part of the game plan last week. He went 8 for 89, had, I think, 3 rushing attempts. Over 55.5 receiving yards for him, I think, is a really good over pick, because he doesn't, the way that the 49ers use him, he's not going to have to square off with these stud Chiefs cornerbacks like Brandon Ayuk might have to in this particular game, because he doesn't run those isolation routes. They get him on the layup routes. And so I think that he can absolutely deliver. The other one that I like is George Kittle at over 47.5 receiving yards at -130. A little bit of juice there, but another player who doesn't have to deal with the stud cornerbacks of the Chiefs. And I think, he blocked his butt off in the NFC Championship game. I think they'll get him more involved as a receiver against Kansas City in the middle of the field, where I think that you can beat up on the Chiefs a little bit as opposed to on the perimeter.
It's funny that everything you just said, Evan, I think the logic is sound. It's actually why I liked Christian McCaffrey when I first looked at it, over 35.5 receiving yards over at DraftKings. His receptions number is 4.5 is the over-under, right? Well, even if he just hits the under there and it's 4, let's just say he catches 4 balls, they're only asking you to get 9 yards a catch on those 4 catches to go over the 35.5. Maybe he has a couple that are like only 5 or 6 yards, but pretty good chance a couple would be like 15, 16 yards too. And I do think that is how Kyle Shanahan is going to attack them. The Chiefs do have good corners, and I think McCaffrey out of the backfield would be one of the better options. So I liked Christian McCaffrey over 35.5 yards. What do you think?
I think it's totally fine. I also think the idea of betting actually the under on Christian McCaffrey, his receptions, and then betting the over on his receiving yards. Sometimes when you do that like reverse correlation in a parlay, you can end up getting like really good plus money. So I would consider that if he goes 4 for 36, you hit both of your bets and you get like plus 300. I mean, sometimes you get really good odds there.
That's interesting. One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about for sure is just all the new coordinators that are going around right now in the NFL. It makes a big difference. I guess maybe that's the first question that I have for you, Evan, is just in your experience. You've been doing this a long time now, man. Do we overrate, underrate, or properly rate the importance of coordinators when we're assessing fantasy football and the value of different players?
Yeah, you mentioned I've done this a long time. I've gone through stages where I thought that, it's all about the players. The coaches, almost create the players. And I think I've kind of leveled off that, obviously they both have immense impacts and the play callers have immense impacts. Now, trying to forecast what the impact is going to be, especially for new coordinators, that can be difficult, but we're going to have a ton of new coordinators this year. So we got to try to get it right. I mean, there's already been 5 or 6, and there's like 10 more openings or some crazy number. Like it's going to be it's an off season of change at the offensive coordinator position.
I saw something. I don't know what the exact stat was, but it's like every coordinator's changed since 2021 or something just ridiculous like that. Which, by the way, just as an aside, Evan, that reinforces the ridiculous value of having a head coach like Sean McVay or Kyle Shanahan that is the head coach, but also the offensive play caller, so that you don't lose that continuity and chemistry, right? Like that's why, one of the things we're talking about today, I mentioned it on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, the fact that Ben Johnson and Bobby Slowick are staying in Detroit and Houston reportedly, that is gigantic, but also it's why I think in particular Washington, maybe Seattle really wanted those guys because that's what you want. Like you want the Shanahan, McVay, I would argue LaFleur, Mike McDaniel model of we're going to have a top 10 offense and that's going to be our head coach and he's not going anywhere. You can't like hire him away from us. We got him because otherwise you could have a top 5 offense like the Eagles a year ago, and then Steichen leaves, or like the Lions this year, and then Ben Johnson leaves, although it looks like he's going to be staying.
Yeah, and it's also the argument against Mike McDonald, who, I mean, I think has done an unbelievable job.
Incredible.
In Baltimore. Unbelievable job. I mean, you just think of the personnel and what they got out of that personnel. The Triple Crown, which I think has never been won before by a defense, the fewest points allowed, most sacks, most takeaways in the NFL. I think that's never been done before. And he did that with a bunch of almost misfits, cast-offs like Jadeveon Clowney and Kyle Van Noy, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the argument against him, is that, hey, you bring in a great OC, like he's going to get plucked. And Mike McDonald will stay there, but he's going to have to continue to recycle OCs.
Before we get into some of these new play callers in new cities, I did have a question. Brian Callahan gets the head coaching job with the Titans, and he's been the OC in Cincinnati. but he wasn't the play caller. Zach Taylor was. So when he goes to Nashville, do we try to figure out what he's going to do, what he's going to be? Do we put a lot of stock in what the Bengals were doing and Zach Taylor? Or do we say, listen, we don't really know. It was Zach Taylor calling the plays? Or do we say, listen, yeah, it was Zach Taylor calling the plays, but Callahan was there. They had success. He's probably going to do similar stuff.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think that I would say that every situation is independent, and the Titans have so much change forthcoming that, they've been a Derrick Henry centric offense for as long as we can remember. So I would say we kind of throw up our hands a little bit because, as you mentioned, Brian Callahan was not the engine, not the top engineer of that offense in Cincinnati, number one. And number two, we have an immense amount of personnel and scheme change forthcoming. They have to remake their offensive line. I assume that Brian Callahan is going to ride with Will Levis, although I don't even think that that's necessarily a guarantee. He's an inherited second-round quarterback. There's so much going on there that I don't know. We're gonna have to explore that one. Go through it as it comes.
Here's what I know, Evan. Whether you're hosting game day or moving night, DiGiorno knows that planning a watch party on a budget isn't easy. You need the perfect setting, the perfect squad, and the perfect eats. Luckily, you're like Evan Silva. You're a game time mastermind, and you know that grabbing DiGiorno classic crust pizza can bring home a dub because it's packed with half a pound of cheese, sauce, other toppings, comes at an incredible price. Make the game-winning call and grab a DiGiorno classic crust pizza from the grocery store today. It is not delivery. It's DiGiorno. Evan, you know how I roll. You got to have something to wash it down. Drink all we drank in Buffalo. Labatt Blue Lights. Bledsoe, the tight ends, the O-line. Drink Labatt Blue Lights with your friends. Live life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. Really curious to pick your brain on some of these new coordinator hires. Let's start with Kellen Moore in Philadelphia, because I was shocked, Evan, that the Cowboys fired him a year ago. I thought that was a disaster. Kudos to Mike McCarthy. Cowboys offense was legit, and I don't really know what happened to the Chargers offense this year.
Yeah, what it seemed to me like they had so many chips in on Mike Williams, and they had him for 3 games. Their offense was really good for 3 games. And then when they lost him for the season, like the bottom fell out, and Quentin Johnston gave them almost nothing. And Austin Eckler had the early high ankle sprain. And that's an injury that will just torpedo a season. He's getting older as well. They leaned so heavily on Keenan Allen, and I don't think that they wanted to do that from the start. They didn't really get much from their tight end position. So they also, their offensive line was, I think, a little bit disappointing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the Lindsley thing was huge.
I was just going to say, losing Corey Lindsley, but it's like they would lose one guy in a spot, whether it be a wide receiver or at center, and then why would that unit just collapse? That's a little bit scary to me. But hey, he's going to inherit a really good offensive line in Philly, a really talented quarterback, really talented wideouts, really talented tight end. I think that he has shown some ability to maximize talent, but it does concern you that, you lose one dude, Corey Lindsley or Mike Williams, in a particular unit, and like all of a sudden that unit goes to crap.
Especially when it felt like in Dallas, they were always losing O-linemen. You had Cooper Rush out there, and they were winning games and moving the ball. I feel like it's probably good for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. I mean, Kellen Moore likes to chuck the rock.
Yeah.
I don't remember him being a huge tight end guy. Maybe I'm wrong. I guess Dalton Schultz and those guys put up pretty decent numbers in
Dalton
Dallas.
Schultz had a big year. I mean, he got the franchise tag 1 year.
Yeah, good point. So maybe it is a pretty good thing for Goddard. Probably not great for the Eagles running backs, but we don't even know who they're going to be. DeAndre Swift is a free agent, so that will be interesting to see how that unfolds. Any other thoughts on Kellen Moore in Philly?
No, I mean, I think we generally agree about him.
All right, Shane Waldron with the Bears did a nice job the last couple of years with Geno Smith. I guess we kind of need to know who the Bears quarterback is, but
Yeah.
your thoughts on what Waldron could mean for guys like DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, etc.
I thought that he was a talent maximizer in Seattle, dealing with, especially this past year, major issues on the offensive line, specifically at offensive tackle. I thought that Charles Cross took a little bit of a step back, and Abe Lucas wasn't there. And their interior was always a work in progress due to injuries as well. So, and he goes to Chicago. See, I had this opinion that the Bears' offensive line is actually underrated, and Justin Fields is a player that, because he holds onto the ball for so long, that he makes the offensive line look worse. I think that they're going to change their quarterback, and that is going to be the ultimate determiner of success for Shane Waldron. But I think that this was a pretty good hire. Actually, a lot of people wanted Eberflus out here. I live in Chicago. A lot of people wanted Eberflus out. See, I thought that he did a really good job with the defense, and bringing in an offensive coordinator like this, from the Sean McVay tree. That tree has had a lot of success. I think this is actually a smart move by the Bears, but they have to get the quarterback right now.
Totally agree, really across the board with what you just said on Waldron, Eberflus. I mean, the Bears came back they were pretty darn good at the end of the year. I mean, they were 5-3, and the 3 losses were to playoff teams. They had big leads on the Lions and Browns. I mean,
should have beat the Lions twice.
What's that?
Should have beat the Lions twice.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's impressive. All right. What are we thinking about Dave Canales, the new head coach in Carolina, and what that means for Bryce Young and the guys down there?
It's such still like a rebuild in Carolina that I don't know. I think it's a scary situation. We can talk about what Dave Canales has done in the past, though. He was Geno Smith's quarterback coach during his breakout year in 2022. And then he goes to Tampa Bay and does a great job with Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield was the 37th highest paid quarterback in 2023 and had a really good season, really chucking the ball up to Mike Evans and to a little bit less extent, Chris Godwin. I just think that, man, they need players in Carolina. And it still rubs me the wrong way that the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 draft was a quarterback who's 5'10", 190. I mean, he looks so small out there. He doesn't really, he can run, but that's not a big part of his game. I think the work is cut out for Dave Canales in Carolina.
So you're really anti Bryce Young?
I don't know. I mean, I think that he showed almost nothing promising as a rookie, and he's 5'10", 190. I don't know.
I'll say this. He has a long way to go, and there's not a great track record for guys like that getting there, but we'll see. The irony of that to me, Evan, is I think they thought their O-line was going to be pretty good, but they brought in Hayden Hurst, Miles Sanders, Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, because they wanted him to have veteran guys to work with. And I think they thought they were going to compete for the division.
And another thing, I know that the internal inside the league, the comparison that a lot of teams made to Bryce Young was Drew Brees. Do you know how perfect you have to be to be Drew Brees? Drew Brees is not like a high-level physical talent. So that means that he has to be almost error-free. He has to be fundamentally, he doesn't make fundamental mistakes. He doesn't make any mistakes. Drew Brees was like the perfect fundamental quarterback That's what you have to be to succeed with that level of skill. And that's just, Drew Brees is like an outlier, and it's tough to make comparisons, I think, to guys who are outliers.
There's like a graveyard full of guys that remind people of Drew Brees or the next Drew Brees.
Right.
It's unbelievable. Any quarterback that's 6 foot, he's like Drew Brees. No, he's not. Drew Brees was a machine, an absolute machine. He's so smart, so accurate. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. All right, these next two are really interesting. Okay, let's go to the Steelers and Arthur Smith. I mean, you want to talk about a coordinator that seems perfectly suited for at least the reputation or the mindset of what the team wants to do or be. That is Arthur Smith in Pittsburgh. What Arthur Smith wants to do is who I think Art Rooney wants the Steelers to be.
Yeah. So the people that I talk to, in like the fantasy community, they're like, Arthur Smith, not him again. He couldn't get the ball to Kyle Pitts and Drake London. And, look, I think that Arthur Smith as a head coach was obviously a failure. And, hitching his wagon to Desmond Ridder and, having like a problem, like an attitude problem with the media all the time didn't help him. And, not being able to get the ball to his playmakers consistently, all the weird stuff that happened with Bijan Robinson. The taste is bad in the mouths of fantasy people regarding Arthur Smith, but I really liked him as an OC in Tennessee. And I think that this is the perfect match for him. The Steelers can really run block, and they've got two solid backs that they use. And they need to find a quarterback, and I don't know if it's not looking like Kenny Pickett is the guy right now. They need to find a quarterback. But the way that they want to play, it's perfect. It's actually a perfect match. And I think that Arthur Smith can build on what the Steelers kind of figured out after they got rid of Matt Canada into 2024. I actually like the hire.
I do too. I think he's kind of perfect. I mean, if he just does the stuff they did in Tennessee, I think that's a pretty good start for what they want to do and can do in Pittsburgh. I think it's great. And then what about Zach Robinson with the Falcons? I mean, honestly, Evan, everybody wanted him, and I don't blame them at all because he's thought of as the next guy with the Kevin O'Connell and the McDaniel and all that tree. He's thought of the next guy. And I can tell you this, I was on the sideline for the Rams and Lions, and that was Stafford's guy. Like every time he came off, it was Stafford and Zach Robinson. Those were the two guys talking and going over things. He was the guy. I think he's ready for this.
That's really interesting. You say everybody wanted him because I'm not necessarily. You're way more plugged in than I am. I was not necessarily aware of that. I'm rooting for him because he's got the PFF background. He's got the McVay background. I really like the hire. Again, they need a quarterback in Atlanta.
They really do. That's the part I think that I feel bad about, Evan, for Arthur Smith. Like, imagine you get one chance to be a head coach and you never have a top 20 quarterback. I mean, they didn't even have a top 25 quarterback. Maybe Matt Ryan was that first year when he's probably top 25 that first year, maybe even top 20. But my point is, you look at like the season win total, Evan, they were like at 4.5 those first 2 years when Arthur Smith won 7 games each. He way exceeded expectations the first 2 years. It was this last year that he didn't meet the expectations. And that's one of those where, like, if you're going to go with Ridder, you got to make sure the owner's like on board with that. Otherwise, you got to try to get somebody better than that or a better option. Maybe they thought Heineke was that.
Yeah, I mean, that's
crazy.
That's the story of their season.
What you got to do is you got to check him out on social media at Evan Silva because he is the man, my original co-host. Love what he does to establish the run. Love having him on the show. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We are at Ross Tucker Pod. Other than that, I'm stuffed. We are done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.